Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. Broadcast on Great Plains TV, that's 26.1 on your dial, or at the Voice for Liberty at wichitaliberty.org. You can find this episode plus all the past episodes of Wichita Liberty TV there. You'll also find show notes for the episodes, so if we talk about something that a website or paper today, we'll be sure to link to that in the show notes. Today, our special guest is Fred L. Smith, Jr. He's the founder of the Competitive Enterprise Institute and currently the director of CEI's Center for Advancing Capitalism. His current focus is bringing leaders in the business and academic worlds together to defend capitalism and craft narratives that highlight the moral legitimacy of free markets. And I should say his appearance on Wichita Liberty TV today made possible by the Bastiat Society of Wichita. So thank you to the board of directors, Raul Burrito, George Pearson, and Erica Zucker. So with me, Carl Peter, John, of course, and Fred Smith. Welcome to Wichita Liberty TV. You know, one of the things that I've appreciated about Competitive Enterprise Institute is the 10,000 Commandments report that Wayne Cruz, I believe, produce every year. And he says that regulatory costs easily exceed the cost of individual income taxes and vastly exceed revenue from corporate taxes combined. That just seems incredible.
It does seem incredible, but it gives us an indication of how the administrative state, essentially the fourth branch of government now, once the progressives, once the interventionists moved away from the accountable forms of government, taxation, which has to be approved, legislature, the judiciary, which was supposed to rein in all this stuff, and the executive branch, whose role was to administer the law. Once they cut loose from all of that and created this fourth branch of government, we pass a vague, amorphous, feel-good law. We throw it over to the executive throws it to one of the agencies that have been created. It's, you know, it's probably more than the door. Everything then becomes possible. No accountability. No real understanding of what you've done until years later.
And I think some of these laws, even like Obamacare at 2,000 pages or whatever it was, it's still full of over and over again phrases like, and the secretary shall promulgate rules to implement this, whatever promulgate means. So it seems like, and I know our former Congressman Mike Pompeo, now director of the CIA, he really, when he was on this show, he would say that Congress needs to do more legislating itself and not turn over so much authority to regulatory agencies.
If you can make Congress accept responsibility again, and the few little attempts to do that, the Congressional Review Act, which passed years ago, they used it once, it worked, and it scared the hell out of Congress. They never tried to use it again for like 20 years. They've used it a few times under this new administration, but Congress it's been a wonderful out for Congress. They can endorse clean water, clean air, health care for everyone, help the poor, do all kinds of wonderful things. And all of the complicated implementation incoherencies are shifted over to the administrative agency, to the administrative state. They get all the real power, but they get all the blame, but nobody knows who they are. So they don't really get any blame at all. And it's an incredible, smart way of having big government while nobody is held responsible for big government. You have to give the left a lot of credit. They've invented a way that's almost like nobody's responsible for the massive amount of government that nobody wants.
Well, I mean, who could be against clean water and all these things that these laws pass? But it's more than the devil in the details. It's the devils that are making the details sometimes.
Well, the idea that you can achieve very massive changes in anything with no cost is a great illusory idea. But you know, they've got away with it for a very long period of time. America's government's been growing pretty much since 1895, 1900. We've had little blips, but boy, there have been little blips.
And I think it's really a problem on both sides of the political aisle, because the left says George Bush, he just deregulated the heck out of Wall Street, and that's why we had the recession. Is that really the case of what happened?
the argument that freedom will ever produce slavery is silly. The idea, what we've seen is we saw partial deregulation in some areas, very minor, and then we at the same time had guarantees socialized investments. What we did was we deregulated, gave people a little freedom, but then across the board, much bigger than that, we said, and if anything goes wrong, we'll bail you out. Well, investment, the whole purpose of capitalism is to invest funds wisely, and if you do it right, you get returns, good profits. If you do it wrong, you can lose your shirt. We decoupled that idea. We started doing it in the 1930s with the deposit insurance. All of a sudden, you and I didn't care which bank we went to, they were all guaranteed. And then it went up to hundreds of thousands. But then we extended that to housing policy, to loan policy, and then to Wall Street policy. So we created a capitalist system with no accountability, and it went wrong, and it went really badly wrong.
Oh, very interesting.
And Democrats and Republicans, as you point out. A lot of Republicans were involved in that, too.
Exactly. Well, let's take a moment off for a commercial break. When we come back, we'll continue on with Fred Smith of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with Carl Peter John and our guest Fred Smith of Competitive Enterprise Institute. Carl, in your experience on the Sedgwick County Commission, there were a couple big regulatory waves or issues that you had to deal with, weren't there?
Well,
thinking about the sustainable communities.
We had a number of issues that came up that created, whether it was some on-the-bench discussions about whether carbon dioxide was a pollutant or just something that each of us emit every time we breathe, as well as issues in terms of regulating professions. Like, for instance, I vividly remember our plumbing discussion in terms of trying to give more choice on plumbing regulations. But Fred, I'd like to ask you a follow-up from earlier, your comments in the last segment about how this was a bipartisan problem. Has the regulatory state worked better when there was complete accountability and one party in charge of all three branches of government, or were we in a better shape like we were budgetarily in the late 1990s when you had Newt Gingrich and the Republicans controlling Congress and Bill Clinton in the presidency, and we actually had a few years where we had balanced budgets? Did that occur in the regulatory world too?
The only regulatory relief periods we had were a brief period in Reagan, first term really, and in Europe and under Thatcher for, again, a brief period. The regulatory state seems to be even less accountable than the budgetary state. So it hasn't been that good because so many of the regulations were promoted by Republicans as good government, efficiency government, and preventing economic downturns. I mean, that was the classic. So I don't think you can give much credit to structural ways of controlling regulation. I think you're right. In the budgetary area, you do seem, when you have divided government, you get a better situation. And generally, divided government is better for everything. But was it good for regulation? The evidence doesn't show much evidence there.
Well, I'd like to follow up, because if the regulatory state being permanent like it is, we've moved away supposedly three branches of government that are offsetting each other, but we now have this fourth administrative state that is even arguably less accountable than our court system, which is naturally insulated from the public. And would you describe this administrative bureaucratic entity that seems to grow regardless, like you said, regardless of who's in charge in Washington, as less accountable and more powerful than even the courts?
I would say the administrative state is the most powerful, unofficial, unaccountable, and non-constitutional arm of government. And the challenge, as you suggest, is that its myriad rules-making policies have infiltrated the whole economy. It's been like an invasive tumor that now invests almost every business in the country, almost every political entity in the country. And to excise that, to pull that out, is akin to a problem of a surgeon trying to take an invasive brain tumor out of an individual. It's an extremely complicated process. That's why I've been talking about this idea of bringing business and the thinking community, the intellectual community together. Could Trump create, could earlier presidents have created workshops, working groups on finance, on transportation, on FDA and so on, to say, look guys, we've got to disentangle the state, separate church and state, separate business and state, but they're so intertangled. We want to do it in a way that is politically viable and that can basically leave behind a viable sub-industry. And to do that, I think working groups or task forces could be convened. Most presidents have economic task forces in the administration, but this time do it to help structure the deregulatory path back to a free market economy again. Hard to do, but you need both the thinkers to push it, and you need the business community to say, well, yeah, we've got to get it out, but be careful. If you cut too close there, you could kill us, that kind of thing.
Well, if we have incredible improvements in computer and communications and transportation, people have a tendency to vote with their feet, and we've seen a lot of businesses go overseas to countries where the regulatory climate is not as negative and is not as bureaucratic and is
or
not
even between the
structured.
states,
Well, and we have it between the states too. You're right, Bob. In terms of what's the is that going to continue to occur if we don't take some of these steps?
It will occur, but again, that is the reason why we need, it seems to me, an alliance between business. American business, the multinationals, operate all over the world, but so do the NGOs, the pro-governmental organizations, the Greenpeaces, the Amnesty International, the Transparency International, and so on. Those groups are at the international level, and often they are conspiring with businesses to harmonize regulations. America's got a lot of regulations. If we could make those regulations harmonized throughout the world, there'd be nowhere to run to. And so what we're seeing now is the exits are being closed off by this international conspiracy to essentially leave no exit. Sartre called that hell, but it was basically like that. We see it now with the United Nations. Well, the climate change was clear. Some people were willing to kill off affordable energy around the world. They moved to make it an international agreement. The trade organizations, free trade was a good idea, but what they did instead was they made it free trade with side agreements for environment, for labor, for all the others. So pretty soon it was this much trade and this much side agreement.
It's really not free, it's managed, regulated.
Managed, regulated trade, and banking regulations, the IMF and everybody else are telling us how to run banking. We have to recognize that the administrative state has made strong allies internationally. So yes, we can still run from state to state to some extent. We can run from the United States to other countries, but all those exits are being closed off too. We've got to really get our act together and then we know where to run.
Interesting. Well, let's take another moment off for a commercial break. I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. Well, welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV again. I'm Bob Weeks, with me co-host Carl Peter John and Fred Smith of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. So Fred, you were talking about having working groups between business and government work together to hammer out the type of responsible regulations that we actually need. And I was thinking, what's this about regulatory capture? I think that's a well-known phenomenon that as time goes on, businesses eventually capture these regulatory bodies and mold the regulations to fitting their needs rather than the common good. I hate to use that word, whatever that means. Is that a real threat, or how can we watch out for that?
Well, it's certainly a threat, and the common example is the first regulation in the business in America was railroads. The railroads were bad guys. They were big. They were a big business, and everybody was scared of them for a while. And so the government moved to regulate the railroads and created a massive bureaucracy. none of whom knew anything about railroads. So, of course, they had to turn to the railroad industry. What the hell do we mean by rates? How do you build a train? How do you decide going from A to B, how many sub-elements and so on? So they used the railroad industry, and actually using the information of the railroad influenced them. But very shortly, by the 1920s or 1910s probably, the shipper groups had captured the railroad. Somebody will, in an area where there are wealth to be earned by being the political preferred party, somebody's going to try to be doing that. The railroads were for the first because they knew the most, but they got displaced very quickly by the shippers, and the shippers were in control then until the 1950s, 60s. And the railroads were in a steady going out of business scale. So I think history suggests, now that doesn't mean businessmen are always wise enough to observe that, but history suggests that when you sip with the devil, you better use a long spoon. Government can give you favors, but the favors they give you this year are almost always paid for by other kinds of commitments. The banks got some favors in getting subsidized and guarantees against losses, but then they had to make a certain percentage of loans that they knew were high-risk loans. So they got a favor and they got a disfavor. Did they come out ahead? Well, a lot of them looked pretty damn bad after the collapse occurs. Some of them got bailed out, but some of them didn't. A lot of people lost their shirts in the banking crisis, and it wasn't always the bad guys.
But let me bring it to a more recent example: healthcare, and the fact that the Ryan plan that came out seemed to be very much within the health insurance industry's desired proposal, and Obamacare had brought the insurance companies in. That was their lesson from Hillary's unsuccessful abortive effort back in the 1990s to have a federal takeover of healthcare. How do we avoid that regulatory capture, especially when we have a statute that supposedly the Republicans said we're going to insurance across state lines, tort reform, we're going to health savings accounts, and none of those items were in the Ryan Care bill, and at least they had a bill that they were talking about as opposed to all of this occurring through the Secretary of HHS promulgating regulations.
Well, you know that old joke about I'm going to do all the problems in the world, and somebody's going to bring peace between Palestine and Israel. He said, "Can I go back to another problem?" You know? I think the healthcare bill indicates how weakened insurance is really. The insurance industry is the method for handling risk, health risk, and automobile risk, crop risk, and flood risk, or it was. But to be a viable insurance industry, you have to look at the risk category, classify people into different categories: high risk, medium risk, low risk, and so forth. And then within the risk pool, you price, because you don't know any better how to differentiate them. And then you're doing a bit of cross-subsidizing within that, because they know more than you do about their risk. And between risk pools, you're aggregating risk and you're cross-subsidizing risk. But to do it, you have to have the ability to decide who you're going to include in this pool and this pool. And under health insurance, you've got to have this condition covered. You can't have any denial of coverage and so forth. As a result, we've made it non-insurable, I think, in the way we've characterized it. I would have brought the insurance industry in, and the analysts who've thought about it, and the health advocates, and say, insurance is a way of dealing with this. How do you make insurance viable? And if there are parts that are non-viable, like in auto insurance, we have the uninsured motorist pool. But that's not for most people. That's the minority in most cases. Some states screw it up and get everybody in it. We needed some way of allowing risk-based healthcare pricing, because most young people would have cheap ones, older people would have more expensive ones. But right now, nobody knows what they're going to get out of an insurance system. I just had 2 cataracts and 2 double knee replacements. I should pay a hell of a lot more than some people did, but my insurance is like everybody else. It sort of covers those. But if I'd have had something else, it wouldn't have covered it at all. We don't know. We've screwed this up so bad that it's going to take a lot of time to get out of it. And I think there was a sort of a naivete on Trump's part probably, but certainly on Congress's part too, that it would be easy to disentangle it. This goes back when government is so invasive there's no easy path back to freedom.
When we come back from this last break, Fred, I'm going to ask you, what has Donald Trump done in just the 2 months or so he's been in office? So we'll take a look at that. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this final segment of Wichita Liberty TV. I'm still Bob Weeks, Carl Peter John, and Fred Smith of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. So, of course, we have a new president, been in office not for very long, just a couple months or so. And it seems like he has had a lot of executive orders that have repealed regulations. How would you rate what he's done so far, and what are the potentialities for reining in regulation under a Trump administration?
Well, executive orders, of course, are the ways that we were violating even the minimal requirements under Obama and under Bush, too. And now Trump is doing it in the reverse order. So we're getting us back more or less to where we were a few years ago. It's not enough to really pull back much of the regulation, but it stops the growth. Mm-hmm. And the budget cuts he's proposed have also will very much. It's not going to be as easy to pass as many regulation with a reduced staff at EPA and some of the other agencies. Mm-hmm. So that's good. And he's moved pretty decisively to illustrate that the idea that we can all live in poverty in a green zoo is the goal of America. Mm-hmm. He's moved away from that. Most importantly, he's shaken up the establishment.
Yes, he has.
No matter what else, if chaos isn't always a nice state, but the predictability we had is no matter what happened, government was going to grow. Mm-hmm. Republicans, Democrats, reformers, it didn't really matter. The administrative state would adjust the dials here and then, would grow. For the first time, we have a president who seems to want to tear it down and start over again. Mm-hmm. Now, that's going to prove to be a lot more complicated than I think all of us hope and think it should be. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't seem to be one deterred by early defeats. We don't know yet. Mm-hmm. But he is the first president in my lifetime, and in a lifetime of anyone in America, who actually sees that the goal is to return America to a minimalist state. He's not a libertarian, as far as I can tell at all. He's a populist in a way, but not in a particularly horrific way. He's not exactly a Herbert Hoover style business leader either. He doesn't fit any mold. Mm-hmm. He's shaking things up, and he's made some incredibly good, as we were talking at the break, some very good cabinet appointees and some very good people in the administration. And, the chips are all on the table. How they're going to end up, we don't know. But it's awful hard not to be more optimistic right now than it was if Hillary had become our president.
Mm-hmm. And I think his nominee for the Supreme Court looks to be pretty good on a lot of regulatory issues. He talks about the Chevron principle or something. I'm not sure I understand exactly what that is. Carl, do you know? Or?
Well, I would put it to Mr. Smith in terms of how big is the Chevron judicial ruling a factor behind this regulatory state that we're so concerned about?
Chevron was a decision that effectively gave extreme deference to the administrative state. Mm-hmm. If a government agency of the administrative state came out with a rule, it could be rejected because it hadn't gone through procedures or because it wasn't logical. It really wouldn't achieve its result. But it would be almost impossible to achieve that through any logical argument if the administrative state said, we've done all of our studies, we're absolutely confident this is going to be a good thing for the world. So essentially it gave carte blanche privileges to the administrative state. Mm-hmm. Chevron has been controversial for a long time. There have been little nibbles at it here and there in some decision, and a lot of us think that removing the checks and balance in this case was an extremely dangerous thing, and certainly gave free rein to the faster growth of the administrative regulatory state.
So interesting. So,
and he may very well, who knows? A lot of judges may be willing to rethink that, mm-hmm. but the court has been very divided, and Gorsuch may or may not be legislative.
The typical business person or activist like myself, looking at this from afar, is this a battle they should be fighting on the legal side? Or is it a fight they should be fighting through, contacting their senators and congressmen, or is it? And how is competitive
You're
enterprise?
talking about regulation in general.
Yes, regulation in general. How is the Competitive Enterprise Institute, addressing this in terms of between the legal and the political, and maybe the activist or any other way that you can in terms of communicating the problems we face to citizens?
Well, it's a multi-front battle. CI does litigate. We've won a number of litigation cases. We've been in Supreme Court as amicus briefs, and occasionally as real defendants on those kind of issues. We won a corporate average fuel economy case some years ago where this was a good example. The auto industry hated the fact that they were being told what kind of cars they had to design. They know people liked big cars, SUVs and large cars. Government was saying you've got to make smaller cars. So they ended up with this weird thing. They made a few small cars at a loss, and then so they could sell their big cars at a profit. And they knew, and we knew, that all things equal, forcing Americans into a smaller car fleet would mean more people would die on the roads. All things equal, if you get hit in an automobile, it's better to be in a tank than in a toy car. But the auto companies wouldn't deal with that. Their legal staff, cars unsafe, don't say a word about that. So we made the argument that CAFE killed. And we made it, we litigated, we did papers on it, we had conferences on it, and we did litigate in that case. And we won a bunch of things, and then 5 years later, the auto company said, oh, CAFE kills. But they needed someone in front to handle the skirmish line challenges. And I think that's sort of true across the board. Chevron and things like that are so sacred to a lot of people on the left that for business to attack them when they're not sure they're going to win is difficult. Yeah. Policy groups, the CIs of the world, but the other policy community groups throughout the United States are often the ones who take on what appear to be the impossible battles, because in raising the saliency of the arguments, we then allow the business community to come in and make their case. Because they have more resources, they have often more data than we do, but they're often more cowardly. They're nervous Nellies, that's for sure.
Well, I can understand that, certainly. So, Fred, we're out of time for this week. So, Fred Smith of Competitive Enterprise Institute, thank you very much. It's been an honor. Carl Peterjohn, I'm Bob Weeks. We'll be back next week.